Hello, you're all very welcome to the second of our monthly LGBT History Club meetings. This is in collaboration with the Linen Hall Library, and it's something that we in the LGBT Heritage Project have started, and you can find more about our project on our social media at LGBT History NI. I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, who is Dr. Amy Finlay-Jeffrey. Amy teaches English at Queen's University Belfast, where she also obtained her PhD, and her thesis was on Irish lesbian writing. And she will be drawing on some of that work tonight, but also she hopes eventually to bring out a book on Irish lesbian writers, provisionally titled Towards a Queer Liminality, Space and Irish Lesbian Writing. I've got to know Amy through her volunteering on our LGBT Heritage Project, and I'm delighted to welcome her tonight. So Amy, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Richard. It's very exciting to be here, although not in person, but thank you so much to everyone who's watching. It's nice to have so many people interested in Irish lesbian writing and Mary Dorcey in particular. So I'm just going to talk a bit about Mary Dorcey's life, her works, in particular the work I'm most familiar with, which is called A Noise from the Woodshed. Hopefully you can see it here. It's published in 1989. And I'm also going to be talking a bit about the context of 1970s, 1980s liberation movements and some of the activities Dorcey was involved in. So Mary Dorcey was born in 1950 in the South Dublin countryside. An active child who enjoyed water sports, Dorcey's mother thought she might become a PE teacher, but she recalls that from an early age, she enjoyed reading books, and this set the direction her life would eventually take as an author, poet and writer of fiction, short stories. Her older brother studied English at university in England and would bring back books for Mary to read during the holidays. Many of these books were unavailable in Ireland as they had been banned under the 1929 Censorship of Publication Acts, under the premise that they were indecent or obscene or advocated the unnatural prevention of conception or the procurement of abortion. Indecent in this context referred to a work that was suggestive of or inciting to sexual immorality or unnatural vice, or likely in some other way to corrupt or deprave. So this included works by James Joyce, the lesbian author Kate O'Brien, Ernest Hemingway and Edna O'Brien, whose Country Girls trilogy was famously denounced by priests in Irish pulpits for its frank depictions of sexuality in 1960s Ireland. And this early exposure to such radical fiction had a profound impact on Dorcey, who realised very quickly that things were done differently in Ireland to other places. So reflecting and growing up in 1950s Ireland, Dorcey notes the climate of restraint, and this is from some of her writings in a book called Gay and Lesbian Visions of Ireland. Silence, repression, censorship, long dark winters, poor food, nuns and priests everywhere, drab clothes, censorship of books and films, fear and suspicion surrounding anything to do with the body or personal life, the total near repression of ideas and information, a Catholic state for a Catholic people, contraception not known of or spoke of. The pill was mentioned only as a medical means to regulate a woman's body. Sex never written or spoken of except in Catholic Church pamphlets for the education of the young, where it was described as marital relations. Intimacy takes place between husband and wife for the purposes of procreation. Homosexual, the worst of all forbidden words, never spoken of or published until 1973.
Excuse me, Amy. Excuse me. I'm going to mute everybody, and then you can unmute yourself.
Okay. So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Dorcey recalls being attracted to women from an early age, but didn't feel tormented about it because she was also attracted to men. She was one of the first students to attend the Open University and later studied in France. When she returned to Ireland aged 23, however, Dorcey became involved in the women's movement and says that her life began to change. She fell in love with a female friend, but didn't see herself as a lesbian as she didn't have any sort of context to put this into. During the 1970s and 1980s, Irish lesbian activism was growing. Lesbianism, which had so long occupied a sort of liminal space in society, was slowly being brought to public attention, coinciding with civil rights movements in America and the UK. So I'll just put my next slide. In America, several lesbian rights groups, such as the Daughters of Bilitis, and gay groups such as the Machonet Society were formed as early as 1950. Many writers were inspired by this type of lesbian feminism, including Mary Dorcey, who lived in America during the 1970s. In a book detailing the early years of the Irish women's liberation movement, Anne Stoper describes the experiences of the first editor of the Irish Times page, Mary Maher, in the early 1970s. According to Stoper, the women's pages were crucial in striking the initial spark of the women's liberation movement because they were taking the first step in presenting the articulation of previously verboten subjects to the public. One such forbidden subject was that of lesbianism. In 1970, the editors of the page received a request from a homosexual woman who requested that a journalist meet with her and document her experiences. A young Maeve Binchy, who had taken up editorship from Maher, interviewed the woman alongside Maher. Stoper notes the anxiety both felt in writing such a story, the genre of which had never graced the pages of an Irish newspaper before. Stoper describes how, according to Maher, the subject of lesbianism was so taboo and poorly understood at the time that the assumption, even among most Irish Times reporters, was that if you knew a lesbian, you must be one yourself, guilty by association. So that's just a picture of a young Maeve Binchy when she was working at the Irish Times. Binchy later wrote that she published the article unnamed as her father was a well-known public figure and any association with this article would threaten his professional reputation. What was produced, however, was a sympathetic portrayal of a lesbian by two unnamed editors. So I'm just going to read out extract from the article. But what about the female homosexual? Much less is known about her, and there is some reason to believe that she is subject to even more suspicion and hostility than her male equivalent. Ironically, the reason why lesbianism is not illegal in England, or in fact in Ireland, is given as the reluctance of civil servants to inform Queen Victoria of the existence of such a horrible vice when the first anti-homosexual laws were drafted in the 19th century. And then the article goes on to say that in the 1970s in Ireland, there are lesbians living in isolation, loneliness, and extreme fear of being discovered. So in this article, the journalist had encapsulated what Mary Dorcey would later cite as being one of the defining features of living as a lesbian woman in Ireland, the silence and taboo surrounding female homosexuality. But in an attempt to break this imposed silence, in 1982, Dorcey published her first poetry collection called Kindling, and in 1989, her short story collection, Noise from the Woodshed, which both take lesbian relationships as a sort of main central focus point. So A Noise from the Woodshed, which published by Only Woman Press in 1989, give voice to many taboo experiences in the sort of 1980s Ireland. While the subject matter of this collection is mostly based on sort of lesbian experiences, this collection also gives voice to other outsiders in Irish culture during the late 1980s. So in the titular story, which is called A Noise from the Woodshed, two women hear a strange noise coming from the woodshed, which upon further inspections turns out to be two lesbians having sex in a sleeping bag. And the noise of the woodshed acts as a sort of metaphor for the whole collection, is the kind of metaphorical sound of sexual outsiders beginning to be heard for the first time. Another story in the collection, A Sense of Humour, examines the exclusion and isolation of women in misogynistic Irish culture. In particular, this story highlights how, akin to lesbians, women who leave their husbands were often vilified. So in this story, Kate, who's a victim of domestic abuse, returns with her children to her parents' home. Her parents are both disapproving and skeptical about the situation. And this is a quote from the book. Caught in the net of silence that was cast over all their lives, Kate is unable to communicate her trauma, as reality, she thought, was made up of the things men did, what could be spoken of in public without lowering the voice, and the rest, all that concerned women only, was a veiled secret, so that even sisters lied to each other. So I'm just going to read a few more extracts from the collection. So in introducing Nessa, the narrator, who, constrained by social mores, must keep her female lover a secret, fearful that she will lose custody of her daughter to her ex-husband, as well as her job in a Catholic school if her secret is discovered. The story is a damning exploration of life for a closeted lesbian, as well as the prejudice divorced women were often subject to. So I'm just going to read you a short extract. So this is the narrator, Nessa, speaking. And so it started, hiding you like a stray dog I had brought in from the streets, which had to be kept from polite company. They compelled me to lie, Nessa. Every name I had heard against women like you, like us, came back to me. Every insult that made us seem corrupt or pathetic. I denied everything I had discovered, denied it to strangers so that they might allow me a little corner in their world. The irony of that story is actually that Nessa's very, very worried that her lover will be discovered, but it turns out her husband's actually gay. So there's kind of a ironic twist at the end. In a country dance, two female friends go to a country dance to meet male suitors, but realize they want to go home with each other instead. When the men see them dancing with each other, they are so enraged that one of them sets the girl's hair on fire, and the women have to literally run for their lives. So this is, at this part in the story, the women have started dancing together. I open my eyes, the music has stopped. Behind you, I see a man standing, his eyes riveted to our bodies, his jaw dropped wide as though it had been punched. In his maddened stare, I see reflected what I have refused to recognize through all these weeks: comfort, sympathy, a protective sister. Who have I been deceiving? I see it now in his eyes, familiar at once in its stark simplicity. Making one movement of past and future, I yield to it, humbled, self-mocking, quick as a struck match. So A Noise from the Woodshed was very well received by critics, and in 1990 Dorcey won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. She continued to publish poetry collections, and in 1997 she published novel Biography of Desire, which also received huge critical acclaim. The 1980s and early 90s witnessed a rebirth of lesbian themes in Irish literature, coinciding with literary trends throughout England and America. The increase of lesbian themes in literature at this period is reflective of the upsurge of women generally in Irish society. The 1970s had witnessed the formation of several women rights groups such as Irish Women's Liberation Movement and Irish Women United, which were critical in addressing the gender inequalities in Irish society. Initially, the rights of lesbian women had not been critical to these women's rights organisations. Sexuality was a divisive issue which threatened the uniformity that groups such as the Irish Women's Liberation Movement were keen to stress. Similarly to the debate that had taken place in America during the formation of women's rights campaigns, issues of sexual differences were eluded in order to present a united front. Tina O'Toole explains that lesbian identity was regarded as a political liability by the leaders of the feminist movement for a variety of reasons, which ranged from overt homophobia within some of these groups to a recognition of the ways in which lesbian identity would be used by opponents of the feminist movements. Sexuality was a tool by which opponents could discredit a woman's involvement in these organisations. Accusations of lesbianism could threaten a woman's job security, as even though female homosexuality was not technically legal, it was still just cause for dismissal. The situation was even more precarious for women with children. Lesbian mothers with children, needless to say, had even more reason to be circumspect. Up until 1992, they automatically lost the right to custody of their children before the court by reason of their sexuality. Dorcey recalls how lesbian women felt compelled to keep their sexuality a secret. There was a distinct closeting of lesbian women in these groups, which was sort of reflective of a wider closeting within certain circles of society. In some of her memoirs, Dorcey details. I came back to Ireland. I went to the women's movement, then in its second year. I met wonderful women. I was enchanted by the exhilaration, self-confidence, energy, wit, anger, vision, but to my surprise, no one declaring themselves lesbian or speaking about it. In 1978, activist Joni Crone, who founded many Irish lesbian organisations such as Lesbian Line, co-organised a women's conference at Trinity College Dublin. The conference was centred on feminism, issues such as violence against women, and the need for safe and legal contraception. Despite the fact that it was on the agenda, it was felt that including lesbianism on the title was too provocative a statement to make in 1978. Crone details how lesbianism was a taboo subject. And she says that sexuality was discussed only in the broadest sense. We realised that if we called the event a lesbian conference, most of the organising collective would be unable to attend because walking through the door would be a public statement. Crone's statements are testament to the huge risk a woman took in Irish society by declaring herself a homosexual in the 1970s. If heterosexual Irish women had limited rights, lesbians enjoyed even less. It's from this background that Dorcey continued to campaign for the rights of homosexuals. She describes the reaction she met whilst campaigning for lesbian rights. Everywhere I went, I was met with horror and amazement. I spoke at a Women's Week in University College Dublin on sexuality. I spoke as an open lesbian describing heterosexuality as sadomasochism and declared, if feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice. It was like a Roman arena. I was the gladiator. I just about escaped with my life. It was reported in the papers the next morning. The Irish Times ran a front page headline, Self-confessed lesbian denounces heterosexuality. Notably, groups such as the Irish Women's Liberation Movement were instrumental in reversing the ban on contraception contraception for women, and the marriage ban that forbid a woman from continuing work in civil and government roles upon marriage. During the 1980s, there was a marked increase in Irish women in public life and tertiary education. The year 1990 saw the election of Ireland's first female president, Mary Robinson. In 1993, the Irish Senate declared homosexuality legal, and in 1995, the ban on divorce was removed. And I'm sure some of you watching will remember these not so past times. So in 1985, two American former nuns, Rosemary Curb and Nancy Manahan, appeared on RTE's The Late Late Show, hosted by Gay Byrne, to discuss their new book, Breaking Silence, Lesbian Nuns on Convent Sexuality. Their appearance, needless to say, caused a high degree of controversy, with the show reporting its highest ever TAM ratings. A prayer vigil was staged outside the studio, and protesters gathered outside the hotel in Dublin where the women were staying. The hotel even received a hoax bomb alert. Gay Byrne recalls how, when it was all over and these two delightful women said goodbye, everybody said, "Is that what all the fuss was about?" And they replied to us and said, "Well, you made all the fuss, don't look at us." The RTE archive has made available some letters of support and protest which the producers received, and they received a great deal of letters from this episode. So I'm gonna read out some of the letters that kind of support what Gay Byrne was doing, and also condemn what he was doing. I was saying to Richard before this began that I have this book, but unfortunately it's stuck in my office in Queens, which I've not been able to get to. So I wanted to share it with you tonight, but I guess this picture will have to do. That's just another picture of some of the protesters outside the studios, and I think there's another image of the Virgin Mary right there. I knew she'd make an appearance again somewhere tonight. So this is a letter in support of the appearance of these lesbian nuns. After Friday night's program, I felt I just had to get in touch to congratulate you on your expert handling of a delicately sensitive topic. I gathered that you had suffered considerable harassment in the run-up to the show from ill-informed and misguided zealots, I expect. In my reckoning, the program would have proved instructive and enlightening to many, and was consequently worth the trouble. And then on the flip side, this is a letter of complaint. Indeed, the ladies in question are but the latest in a long chain of guests who have appeared on that particular show over the years, whose degenerate and perverted views are utterly repugnant to the vast majority of people who respect normal values in our society. Homosexuality was also brought to the forefront of national consciousness due to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. Colm Tóibín's 1999 novel, The Blackwater Night Ship, explored these issues, as it is centred on a gay man who returns to Ireland following his AIDS diagnosis. In 1983, a 31-year-old gay man, Declan Flynn, was beaten to death by a gang of teenagers in Fairview Park in Dublin. The judge ruled extremely favourably to the defendants, issuing them with a suspended sentence and declaring that their crimes could never be called murder, implying that their crime was an act of civic duty. The Dublin Lesbian and Gay Collective organised a protest march in response, which proved to be the largest event of support of gay rights Ireland had ever seen, according to Joni Crone. It was within this context that more Irish gay and lesbian writing was fast appearing, though not receiving immediate attention from critics. Maura Richards' Interlude was published in 1982, and it's not a very well-known novel at all. This was actually the first lesbian novella since Kate O'Brien's As Music and Splendour, published in 1958. A prolific writer, Edna O'Brien published lesbian novel The High Road in 1988, and in the following year, Mary Dorcey published her debut, A Noise from the Woodshed, followed by June Levine's A Season of Weddings, 1992, and Linda Cullen's The Kiss, 1990. None of these books received due critical attention at the time of publication, and it has only been in recent years that scholarship has begun to re-evaluate their works. Also, novels about gay men were increasing. In 1990, Tom Lennon, writing under a pseudonym in fear of losing his teaching job, published teenage gay love story, When Love Comes to Town. And this is a really interesting novel, but again, unfortunately not very favourable for the representation of lesbians. Throughout the 1990s, Colm Tobin published books about gay men, such as The Story of the Night in 1996. In terms of lesbian writing, Edna O'Brien was the most established of such authors writing at this time, yet the lesbian elements in her work were continually kind of overlooked at the time. And it is due to this fact that Emma Donoghue is continually recognised as the most famous Irish author and the kind of face of lesbian fiction from 1990 onwards anyway. Feminist publishing houses throughout the UK and Ireland were thriving during the 1980s. English authors such as Sarah Maitland and Jeanette Winterson were including lesbian themes in their novels and gained international recognition for their work. Jeanette Winterson's debut Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit won the Whitbread Award for her first novel in 1985. The success of such publications in the UK undoubtedly paved the way for a climate whereby Irish authors felt enabled to write about same-sex themes, although not initially enjoying the same success as their English contemporaries. In Ireland, feminist publishing houses like Attic Press produced a high volume of lesbian novels, short stories and essays, such as those penned by feminists such as June Levine and Anna Livia. The importance of these groundbreaking publishing houses in Ireland should not be underestimated. It provided a vital link between the ideologies and theories of feminist groups and the wider reading public, and it is clear that the availability of feminist texts disseminated radical social ideas throughout Irish culture and society. So Mary Dorcey continues to publish poetry and fiction, and her most recent collection poetry collection was published in 2016. Her work has been taught globally and on many A-level and Leaving Cert courses, and she's held various academic positions throughout Ireland and Europe, and she's won a hefty amount of awards for her work. That said, though, her more recent work retains the same commitment to break taboos and deal with honesty, write with honesty about the lives of women, and she currently lives in Ireland. And that is really all I have to say. I have another slide with some further reading if anyone is interested. These books are really kind of about kind of lesbian culture. If you're interested in kind of things to do with the early days of the women's movement and the Irish women's movement in particular. And the interview that Dorcey gave in Lesbian and Gay Visions of Ireland has formed really the basis of this talk, as has articles from the Women's News collection, which I'm looking at in my involvement with the LGBT project. So yeah, that's all I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I'm going to turn off the recording now, and we'll take questions. If I can just find stop